2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me okay? How about now? Oh, something vibrated there. That was it. Maybe it's just can't pick this up over here, you think? No? Tick, 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 tick. Hey, hey, hey. Why am I not hearing anything? Tick, tick, tick. What? Oh, yes, that's loud.
Good morning, folks. If you want to fill up your coffee mugs and make your way. Oh, y'all got quiet fast. Y'all are good. I think we're all about ready. Looking for some head nods. Good morning. Welcome to week 2 with our friend David Waters and a conversation about the news and the good news. I'm Catherine Bush, Associate Rector for Formation here at Calvary Church. Welcome to those of you who are here in the Great Hall, and to those who are joining us remotely. It's good to be together, however we might be gathering today. Last week, as I introduced David, I shared his quite impressive resume with you, his time at the Commercial Appeal, the Washington Post, his awards, his current position at the Institute for Public Service Reporting. But as he pointed out last week, there are lots of ways to measure impact. And lines on a bio are sometimes just like clicks on an article. A click can tell you that someone read the piece, but it can't tell you that someone read a column in 1998 about one of their students, and that led to an invitation to speak in chapel, which led to a conversation over a cup of coffee, and then lingering to speak in a classroom, and then to a close to 25-year on-again, off-again relationship. None of that is in the Commercial Appeals data grab. And the official bio doesn't include a long-haul marriage to a woman who has taught innumerable children to read herself, and even more children through the teachers she's taught how to teach children to read, including her own daughter, who is now a kindergarten teacher teaching children how to read. And they're raising a son who is now a local housing advocate. You probably want to follow and support Homes for Hearts. And another son who is on his way to grad school to help restore our political sphere. None of these apples fell far from the tree. And that's impact. And that's very real. And it's also kind of hard to track with basic analytics. So, we're going to have another delightful, impactful conversation, none of which will be tracked, as far as I know, other than maybe by some number at the top of some screen on Calvary's little website. Whether you were here last week or not, whether you read the Beatitudes like good homework-doing students or not, today's going to be a great conversation, and I'm real glad that y'all are here, and I'm especially glad that David is back with us. Thanks.
How's that? Sound better? Okay, great. By the way, thank you for that disclaimer about analytics, but I just got the notice that my screen time was down 59% last week, so we're getting there. Thank you for that introduction. Catherine and Stephen have been so unbelievably important to my family and my wife and my children. You know, when you're a parent, you realize that you're going to screw them up somehow, right? And all you can really do is help them understand that when they are adults and they are screwed up, that they can find help and how to get that help. So, despite our best efforts, they turned out really, really well. I have notes today, but I don't have prepared remarks, so that we might all regret that at some point today. But I'm gonna give it a go. I was talking to my mom about the news. She's 83, she was born in 1939, and we were talking about how her parents, my grandparents, and my parents, and us, and now my kids got the news. And my grandfather was born in 1912. He was actually born the same day the Titanic sank. So obviously he wasn't aware of that at the time, but his parents probably were at some point. They didn't find out right that minute, but the only way they found out that the Titanic had sunk was probably weeks later in the local paper where they lived in West Virginia. And that's all the news they ever got for years and years, was just whatever local paper they had. It might have been a daily, it might have been a weekly. No radio, no TV. Eventually they got radio, so they would listen to the radio and get some news from the radio. So my grandparents mostly got their news from the local paper, wherever they were, and the radio. They didn't have a TV until the 50s. My mom didn't have a TV until she was a teenager. So my parents grew up getting the news from the local paper. They read the local paper every day. And back then, the local paper, I'm sure you remember, was very thick. Even local papers like Memphis and Cleveland, where I grew up. You had a lot of news every day in the paper, pages and pages of national news, international news. So they had a pretty good source for news. And they would watch the evening news, either with Walter Cronkite or David Brinkley and Chet Huntley and whoever was on. And they might, I have this vague memory of at some point seeing Newsweek magazine show up in our house every week. So basically, people in the 60s and 70s got their news from one of three sources. You either got it from the local newspaper, and there might have been one or two in your town. You got it from local evening news. There might have been three stations you had to choose from, but it was all basically the same, just a different news reader. Or you might have gotten it from Time or Newsweek or U.S. News, the news magazine. Now, those were all really good sources of news and information, but they were pretty much all the same. Everybody got the same version of the news, the same version of what was happening in the world. Fast forward to when I was growing up and when my kids were born, Everything has changed so fast in the last 20 years. We talked about this last week. Not only do we have different versions of the news, but we have different versions of reality. Constant, endless flow of news. Cable, talk, radio, phone, social apps, countless sources of news and information. We're inundated with news, we're inundated with information and opinion, and it's not the same. Depending on what's in your pocket, what's on your phone, it may be a completely different source of information than your neighbor or one of your relatives. So what do we do with all this news? We asked this question last week, 2 questions. What do we do with all this news? And what is all this news doing to us? And I talked last week about maybe the first step is how do we control this inundation of news that we're all experiencing, or most of us are. And I suggested that maybe we start by taking a news Sabbath every week. We take a sabbatical from the news. It might be half a day, it might be a full day. And we'll talk about that in a minute, I hope. I hope some of you tried that. But I want to talk about the Sabbath for a minute. By the 7th day, as we all remember in Genesis 2, God had finished the work he had been doing, so on the 7th day he rested from all his work. And God blessed the 7th day and made it holy. That's the first time the word holy appears in the Bible. In the beginning, time is holy. In the 10 Commandments, the word holy is applied only once to the word Sabbath. There's no mention of a sacred place, only sacred time. Rabbi Heschel and others have pointed out that the Sabbath day was the first cathedral, a portable cathedral in time. Heschel wrote, "Technological civilization is man's conquest of space. It is a triumph frequently achieved by sacrificing an essential ingredient of existence, namely time. The meaning of the Sabbath is to celebrate time rather than space." Wayne Muller, who's a Christian minister, says, "Sabbath is God's way of pushing the pause button on creation. Because we do not rest, we lose our way. Sabbath time assumes that if we step back and rest, we will see the wholeness in it all. Sabbath time honors the necessary wisdom of dormancy." And Rabbi Kushner says there are 2 biblical Hebrew words to describe God resting on the Sabbath. The first means he ceased his labors, and the second means he got his soul back. We are commanded to rest on the 7th day, first to demonstrate our freedom from slavery, Heschel says, and second, to get our souls back. Now, why would he mention slavery? This isn't ancient Israel, ancient Egypt. This isn't 19th century America. What's he talking about? And so he writes, "In the modern world, the issue of slavery is not a question of who owns your body, but who owns your soul and who owns your time." So who owns your time? Who owns your attention? Which channels, devices, apps, platforms, media outlets own your time? And what's all that doing to your soul? I want to read something from one of my favorite writers, Walter Brueggemann. Everybody knows Walter Brueggemann, right? In the Gospel of Hope, he wrote, "The world is waiting for Christians who are not angry or anxious or weary or quarrelsome or cynical or in despair. The world is waiting for folk who trust enough to move out beyond themselves." He also wrote about the news. "The urgent news is that our society is on the way to our common death by greed, by lust, by indifference, by cynicism, by despair, by 1,000 forms of violence and brutality. That is the main story in the news. And in the midst of all that, Jesus has put this little community that may make a difference, reverse the process, break the cycles, practice our God-given humanness and gather the power and love and the self-discipline to do it. I read that because Brueggemann writes a lot about the Sabbath too. And he says, if you think about it, the Sabbath is entirely counterculture. It runs counter to what he calls the commodity economy. And he also calls it the predatory economy. And the commodity economy tells us that we are not enough. We don't have enough. We can't get enough. How are we going to get more? He says Sabbath time, if we take Sabbath time, if we honor the Sabbath and keep it holy, whatever that means for us, 24-hour period, 6-hour period, every week. Sabbath time reminds us and helps us understand that we don't have to meet any of these expectations today. We can feel the full embrace of God's grace. We know that nothing is lacking and there's nothing to fear. Nothing is lacking and there's nothing to fear. Now, that's not what the news tells us. And if you think about it, news is a commodity. It's bought and sold. It's manufactured, marketed, distributed, measured, monetized. Cap and I were just talking about how digital world now monetizes and measures every single click. Tells you what you clicked on, how long you were clicking on it, how much up and down you scrolled, if you clicked over to something else, if you read an ad on that page. Every single movement and moment is measured. And that changes the news. When I was at the Commercial Appeal, we stopped counting the number of people who subscribed to the daily paper and started counting clicks. So you knew who was clicking on your story. And if you weren't generating enough clicks, you heard about it. And you found out what was generating clicks. And you may have noticed that over the past 10 years, there's been an incredible increase in the amount of coverage that we've given basketball. Now, you might think basketball is the most important thing that's happening in this community every day. And for some people, it may be. But that's because we all click on basketball stories. And that's what they count. So we have more sports coverage than we've ever had, even though we have less overall news coverage than we've had in a long time. So if you think about all of this monetized, measured, manufactured news, the news we consume, we are consumers of news. Where does that news come from? It comes from the commodity economy. It comes from the politics of fear and division. The news is the politics of fear and division. We have news from the economics of scarcity and self-interest, and news from the world that tells us that this place is full of danger and anger and chaos. If you think about the news of the past week, how much of that is anchored in fear and division, scarcity and self-interest, danger, chaos, confusion. Ukraine, Canada, convoys in Canada, the border, blockages, COVID. Inflation, abortion, book bans, speeding on the interstate, pedestrian fatalities. We're just inundated all the time, locally, nationally, with what's going wrong. And we need to know these things. We need to know what's happening. But we can't allow ourselves to be inundated with it, to be overwhelmed by it. So that's why I suggested last week that we all try to take a news Sabbath. So I showed you my screen time was down 59%. How'd y'all do? Did anybody try to take a news Sabbath? Yes, sir, right here. Yeah, ma'am, you in the back. You go first. So what did you try to do? Wow.
Because of you.
Well done.
Even David Brooks. It made a tremendous difference.
So
Because
tell me,
I've been very...
how did it make a difference in your...
It made me not so... My mind was able to go to other things. I was able to sleep better. I wasn't conscious of that before, but I looked at birds eating. I tasted my food better. It was very, very meaningful.
So what, in a normal day, normal course of a day, what's your news consumption look like?
Do you want me to tell you which commercial channels I turn into?
You don't have to give any brand names. Just,
Well,
you watch TV, you read your phone, what do you do?
I read the Commercial Appeal and the New York Times in print, and thanks to you, I've just started reading the Wall Street Journal on an iPad. I in the past have pretty much, not kept a cable channel on. It's MSNBC. And I thought it was very smart and savvy until I began to realize it was all many of the commentators were focused on one big negative issue, which I had enjoyed before. And I realized how polarizing it was. And I thought before if I would watch Fox News and MSNBC, but I just got more angry all the time. So I just thank you, David, because it was I do a lot of retreat work, and I never let it affect my news consumption. So you've helped me understand that I can read the news. I really enjoyed reading the news and not the opinions. So I thank you.
Who else tried a news Sabbath? I hear Cap.
We did. We decided to not watch the news on television, on any of it, and that helped. We even started watching the news while we ate, and we'd never done that before. Maybe that was we were victims of COVID and that routine, but we did that. Yeah, we stopped doing it. I also stopped reading all op-eds, all of them, whether they were liberal, which means I agreed with them, or somebody else. I do read the news from two sources, which I like, the New York Times and the Washington Post. Circumstances, we don't get the Commercial Appeal now because we're out of our home for circumstances which we don't need to go into. But it really helped. It gave me more time. It made me calmer, particularly not reading op-eds. So, thanks.
Good. Anybody else? Yeah.
Well, I guess I'm cheating. I didn't do this because I was here last week, but I have taken a sabbatical, coincidentally, in the last month. And I've done it before. And not that it's news, but too many of us think it is, social media. And for me, social media can drive me to whatever news I might take in. And I just took some of that social media stuff off my phone. I didn't shut it down, but it's just not in my face all the time. And it's made a big difference. I tend to easily get agitated and discontent and irritable. And I found, that's helped quite a bit. And I long ago gave up cable news of any sort, whether it's throwing me red meat or throwing others red meat. And frankly, I look at a aggregator of news once a day. I read things that catch my interest very briefly, and that's about it. And it helps.
So what caused you to go on these news diets?
Because I'm easily agitated, restless, irritable, and discontent. But and I'll tell you too, because whatever I think is correct and right, whatever I take in that feeds that drives me to disagree with others, and I don't need any help in that area. I don't need anything that fuels that. So.
Yeah, I mean, just think about, I used to talk about this with folks at the Commercial Appeal back when the Commercial Appeal was really the only game in town, and everybody read it. And I used to think, you know, we need to focus more on, we need to have more balance about what's happening that's good, what's happening that's productive, what's happening that's working, because that's reality too. And I said, just imagine if every morning somebody came to your house and just started banging on your door, yelling at you, telling you what happened yesterday that went wrong. You'd get tired of that person really quick, or it just would make your whole life really anxious. And now, we're not just banging on your door once a day, we're coming in your living room, and we're in your living room all day long. And we're wherever you go. We're in your pocket, wherever you take us with you now. And it's just constant banging, banging, banging. And I really appreciate what you said, because I think, you know, if you don't want to think about it in terms of a Sabbath, you know, taking a complete break for a whole day every week or half a day every week, if that's too much, too soon, you know, think about going on a news diet. You know, think about the consumption of news that you now have, and maybe just try to cut it in half and see how that goes. Or maybe reduce a certain kind of, maybe just get rid of all the social media on your phone and try that. Or stop watching cable news and try that. I really, honestly, I think it may be necessary going forward in this society. I think it may be the one thing that we can all do to stop feeling so polarized and so angry and so anxious all the time. And I think the op-eds are a good way. You know, I hate saying that because I grew up wanting to be a columnist. I love columnists. And I liked writing editorials when I did it. But they have to have a point of view. And they're really just mostly one person's point of view. And that's fine. But you have to be more, and the best columnists, they don't intentionally try to provoke, but they are provocative. They don't just make you think, they get you upset, and you really agree with them in a way you're upset, or you really disagree with them in a way that makes you upset. So I'm really encouraged to hear this. Anybody else want to share their news Sabbath? Yeah, Pat.
I tried, but I'm a news junkie, and I found myself going straight to the television in the morning to see if the Russians had invaded the Ukraine.
And what'd you find out? They haven't yet.
I wanted to say that I found that it's easier for me to listen to the news, the audio part, you know, like on NPR, rather than, I could do that rather than watch it on TV. And so I do that about, you know, a couple of times a day for maybe the 30 minutes on NPR. And then I also record the NBC Nightly News, and this is awful. It's so that I could fast forward through things that upset me or made me anxious. So, but I did notice a real difference in listening as compared to watching.
So. Yeah, that's a good point. Try that too. Over here.
I'm hoping that by confessing, I will follow through with some of my good intentions. I honestly, I subscribe to the Commercial Appeal, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the New Yorker, and I cannot for the life of me figure out how anybody has time to read all that stuff. I have great intentions of reading the important stuff about the Ukraine, and I find myself just drifting right to the real estate. I mean, I love those $5 million mansions. They're a lot more interesting. But the other thing, I don't have cable. I've had just wireless television for 5 or 6 years now. And I love that because I never watch the news in real time. I listen to NPR in the mornings and then it's gone. But Facebook is the killer for me. and I gave it up for Lent last year, and I really wish I'd never picked it up again. So this year, I'm hoping it will be a permanent change. But how do you have time to read all that stuff?
Yeah, well, that bringing up Lent, I mean, Lent's coming, so that might be one way to go, is just to think about what you might give up, what media source you might give up, social media or cable news or something. Just try it for 6 weeks and see how that goes. Just one thing. Just try one thing. My son, who's 27, who lived on Twitter for years and years, we started talking about it last fall, and this is one of those rare occasions when you don't think your kid's listening to you, but they actually are listening to you. We talked about social media and the impact it's having on our nerves, our national nerves and our individual nerves, and we're just inundated, blah, blah, blah. And I found out a couple weeks later, he took Twitter off his phone. He stopped tweeting. And within a month, he said he felt so much better that he wasn't constantly being engaged in this noise. And there are some really great things about Twitter. You know, you can find out what's happening, and you know, especially if you're a sports fan. I mean, it's great for sports, but it's just constant. And I don't do Twitter, and I cannot figure out how anybody who is on Twitter keeps up with it. It's just, you're just getting tweeted all day long, just constantly, and it's got to mess with your head somehow and your emotions and your soul, because you're just constantly looking for what's next. I don't know how people do it. Like you said about all the news information you can get. I mean, just social media, I don't get that either. But try a news diet, try a news Sabbath, try giving up some sort of news and information for Lent, and see how that goes for you. I want to get to the second thing I wanted to talk about, the second assignment I gave you all last week. Heidi, are you here? Heidi Rupke? Anyway, she asked a great question last week, and I kind of fumbled it, and we talked on email about it. Her question was, we have so much more information than we can act on. How do we use news in the service of living beyond just our intellect? How do we continue to care and to act lovingly when there are so many stories, so many needs, tragedies, issues, and so on? How do we stay connected? And, you know, my thesis is that more often than not, news disconnects us from each other, separates us, polarizes us. And it's really difficult to stay connected or to not get disconnected, even in church. I mean, if you think about our churches now, are more polarized than maybe they've ever been. The people you go to church with, generally you agree with them, politically, philosophically, spiritually, and otherwise. So even our churches are siloed, even our churches are polarized. So how do we not only stay connected, how do we reconnect with each other across all these divides in the midst of this, you know, Mississippi River of news and information that we're getting all the time? Well, I think as people of faith, we have to do it the way we've always done it. And we have to remember there's another kind of news. And there's another story. And there's another narrative. There's another narrative that shows our common humanity, our common purpose, our common challenges and goals, our common wealth. I want to read something from Muhammad Yunus. I don't know if you know who Muhammad Yunus is. He's the guy who started the Grameen Bank. He started all the microfinancing many years ago in Bangladesh, and it's kind of become a worldwide movement to try to help poor people get money to help them start businesses. It's moved into the U.S. Now it's called the social business movement. There are actually like big business schools that are teaching about social business, how you start social. These are not nonprofits. These are not for-profits. They're social businesses. So they work to make money, but they don't work to make profit. It's a fascinating concept. But he talked about how, you know, our whole economy is sort of built on this idea of the capitalist man, capitalist woman, the idea that we all act in our own self-interest. And because we act in our own self-interest, that makes things work out eventually, because we're all trying to do for ourselves, and we end up in the process somehow doing for others. And he said that doesn't really work for him. He talks about how that's really not just self-interest, that's selfishness, it's greed. And so he says, instead of focusing on this capitalist man, capitalist woman, why don't we think about the real person? And he says, the real person is a composite of many qualities. He or she enjoys and cherishes relationships with other human beings. Real people are sometimes selfish, but just as often they are caring, trusting, and selfless. They work not only to make money for themselves, but also to benefit others, to enhance society, to protect the environment, and to help bring more joy, beauty, and love into the world. So those are stories. That's the news too. So where are we getting those stories? We're not getting a lot of them in the news. So where else do they come from? I think we get them sometimes in Sunday sermons. I think sometimes in books, like Walter Brueggemann. Ted Lasso, anybody watch Ted Lasso? I mean, that's just the sweetest show. I wrote a story a couple of months ago. I called them the Kidney Brothers, if anybody saw it. It was a story about Colenso Hubbard, Father Hubbard, who has had lots of issues. He's been on dialysis a long time. He needed a kidney transplant. And he has a really good friend named Lee Giovanetti. And Lee is a wealth advisor. Colenso's been working with poor people all his life, and Lee's this white, wealthy guy who's a wealth advisor. And they became friends, and they got to know each other, and over the course of 20 years working together, and when Lee found out that Colenso needed a kidney, he stepped right up. And he made sure that Colenso couldn't get his kidney because they were not a match, but he went through this matching process with other places. And anyway, Colenso ended up getting a kidney because of Lee. Now, they're two completely different people, and they probably have two completely different sources of news and information for sure. They live in two very different worlds, but they have this relationship. They know each other. They know each other as human beings, as fellow men of God, children of God. And that's what matters. It doesn't matter who they voted for. It doesn't matter what's happening in Ukraine. Colenso needed a kidney, and Lee had one he could spare. And it's that simple. And I think those stories are out there too. And we need to find, I think it's time for the church to help us tell a different narrative, not just on Sundays, not just in sermons, or not just in Bible studies. We're all part of the world. We're all part of this news universe, and we have to find other ways to demand these other narrative stories and to tell them. And I think that that's crucial for all of us. I talked last week about the Sermon on the Mount. Read the Sermon on the Mount and think about it in terms of blessed are the peacemakers. Peace is another word for shalom. Shalom being sort of our whole commonwealth, our whole goodness. So think of being, we can either be shalom makers or shalom breakers. And what do you find mostly in the news? Do you find a lot of shalom makers? Probably not. You find more shalom breakers in the news. So I want to read a story from a shalom maker. I hope you all are familiar with Father Greg Boyle, Tattoos on the Heart. If you haven't read it, please read it. He's a Catholic Jesuit priest in East LA, in the poorest parish in East LA, and mostly Hispanic, Latino. And he's been there for, 30 years, 40 years. And he wrote this book to help, to tell stories about that work and those people in that neighborhood. And when you read this book, you realize you can't help but know that we have this common humanity. And we're all children of God. And we have to be constantly reminded of that because so much out there is reminding us or telling us that that's not true. So he tells this story about the fact that they started letting homeless men sleep in the church, in the parish. And he said the smell was never overwhelming, just undeniably there. The Jesuits figured that if we can't fix it, then we'll feature it. So we determined to address this discontent in our homilies. People were complaining about the smell. And our Sunday homilies were often dialogic in those days. So one day I began with, what's the church smell like? People are mortified. Eye contact ceases. Women are searching inside their purses for what they know not. Come on now, I throw back. What's the church smell like? Don Raphael booms out. Smells like feet. He was old and never cared what people thought. Excellent, I said, but why does it smell like feet? A woman says, because many homeless men slept here last night. I said, well, why do we let that happen here? Another woman says, it's what we've committed to do. And I say, well, why would anyone commit to do that? And someone yells out, it's what Jesus would do. And I said, well then, what's the church smell like now? And a man stands up and says, it smells like commitment. The place cheers. Guadalupe waves her arms wildly. Smells like roses. The packed church roars with laughter and a newfound kinship that embraced someone else's odor as their own. The stink in the church hadn't changed, only how the folks saw it. The people at Dolores Mission had come to embody Wendell Berry's injunction, you have to be able to imagine lives that are not yours. Scripture scholars contend that the original language of the Beatitudes should not be rendered as blessed are the single-hearted, or blessed are the peacemakers, or blessed are those who struggle for justice. Greater precision in translation would say, you're in the right place if you are single-hearted or work for peace. The Beatitudes is not a spirituality, it's a geography. It tells us where to stand. So I think that that's what we need to be thinking about. Where does the church, the people of God, stand in the midst of this inundation of negative, angry, chaotic news that we're getting every day? Where do we stand? How do we stand against that? How do we tell a different story? How do we talk about a different kind of news? How do we find ways to share our common humanity? And I think it's not just enough to stop inhaling all this noxious stuff. We do need to do that, or less of it. But I also think it's incumbent upon all of us to find other ways to tell those kinds of stories, to have a sort of a counter, an alternative to this negative news. And we can all do that in our own lives. We can all tell these stories. We can all get to know people across the aisle. We can all get to know people outside this, in the parking lot. And once you get to know those people and you see them on this certain level, I think you're not going to be immune to the news that we get, but I think you're going to be able to see it in a different light. I think you're going to be able to receive it in a way that doesn't kill your soul. Because you're going to know that, yeah, the Republicans may be saying this about the Democrats or vice versa, but I know Republicans, I know Democrats, I know that's not who they are. Somebody may be saying this about Muslims, but I know Muslim folks, and I know that's not who they are. I remember having a conversation about 12 years ago, how much time I got? 5 minutes. With this older couple who were parents of friends of mine. We had dinner, and they had been caught up in this anti-Sharia movement, which was all over right-wing radio and Fox back about 10 years ago. Sharia was the big evil that was going to destroy America. And they were convinced this was true. And they were also convinced that they understood what Sharia was. These were lifelong folks who grew up in the church. They'd never been to a mosque. But they knew more about Sharia than most Muslims. And whatever Muslims said about Sharia wasn't true, because they knew what Sharia really was. And it was a dangerous, deceptive force. And we had to be prepared to stop it. And I kept asking them questions about it, trying to find out what they knew about Sharia. And I said, well, what do your Muslim friends say about this? And they looked at me like I had just asked them, I don't know what, like they didn't have any Muslim friends. Now, think about that. If you had been in a group of Muslim folks who had been saying these things about Jesus and these things about Christianity and how evil it is and how awful it is and how, Christians are trying to evangelize everybody across the world and turn them into, and you would be saying, well, but you don't understand Christianity. You have a distorted view of it. You really don't get it. So I think that one of the things we can do, in addition to sort of taking this news diet that I'm talking about, is to develop relationships, not just read other sources of news and find other sources of information, but talk to other folks. Get to know, if you're a Democrat, liberal, get to know some Republican conservatives and find out what really bothers them. What are they really concerned about? What really has them anxious about all this? Why would they vote for Donald Trump? I mean, what is that? What's going on? We all have relatives probably who do that. So I think we have to remember that we have to have relationships across the aisle, not just read other sources of news across the aisle. Have relationships with the other to help us figure out that they're all human beings and we all have this common ground we can find, and to tell those stories. It's happening every day. One of the things Jonas talks about, he talks about real person, real people. There are millions and millions of people going out there every day to try to make things better. There's one right there. Pat Morgan's been doing that for 50 years. I don't know, maybe longer. And you're not going to read much about Pat Morgan in the newspaper, but you should. And everybody in this room probably is doing something that we should be writing about and reading about, because it will encourage us and it will show us that we're all in this together and we're all trying to make it better. So, enough of my preaching. Did anybody want to say anything before we close? Yeah, Pat.
Thank you for that, but thank you very much, whoever sent the Beatitudes to us. And that came from you, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think I'm in trouble.
Well,
Because I know I'm not doing all that, but it sure was a wake-up call.
we all fall short, don't we? One right there.
Your point about learning from people with whom you think you would automatically disagree. There's a wonderful book from right after 9/11 called The Faith Club, and it's the story of 3 women of different faiths who came together to learn from each other. And they were New Yorkers, and in the midst of their coming together, there were painful disagreements, there was a lot of love, and their circle grew and grew. And it's an incredible story of getting beyond that, whatever that automatic barrier is that we build around ourselves that says, I said it, so I must be right. And reaching out and learning from others. And I highly recommend it. It's a timeless story.
Great, thanks. Okay, well, good luck with your news diets. And thank you for listening to me, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.